I had in mind this morning, since we had gone at length into the carpet bag in yesterday's entry, that I would go through it and give representative examples of each of the pseudonyms that Matthew wrote under in the carpet bag. And then I realized there's way too many of them. And then I started looking into them and I realized there's so many period references in these things that, it's really prohibitive. It would take a real scholar of 19th century America to go through and really know the background of each of these things. I've looked up, because Matthew embedded all of these little clever references to his times, just like, a political satirist would today. And I've looked up about, maybe half of them or something, but I can't remember them and I don't really understand it in depth. So what I decided to do instead is just to focus on this one pseudonym, Trismegistus, and to show just how these things get misattributed to other writers. Now, this also applies equally to the famous cases that people just roll their eyes in their head and dismiss, like Edgar Allan Poe and The Raven. But we now don't have the bugaboo of fame here. These are obscure. There's only a few people that have delved into this carpet bag and know about Trismegistus and Ensign Stebbings and Dr. Digg and so on. You can find references online. There's a few people that are interested in this. So this is kind of the dynamics of how this happens. Yesterday I mentioned that Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, the editor of the carpet bag, had said in his memoirs that Trismegistus, that pseudonym, and the spin-offs from that, including the military hero Ensign Stebbings, who ran for president like Pat Paulson, and Dr. E. Gertie Digg, who was the caricature of academia, that those were spin-offs and a number of other things, and that all of that was written by, or at least initiated by, Benjamin Drew. He was a teacher, a career teacher, and a school principal. Again, I got into his papers, and he was kind of a milquetoast, mild, bland fellow who I think had aspirations of being what Matthew was, except that, of course, he had a career and he had an income, and he also wrote, I think, for the Boston Post, and that's probably how he met Shillaber. But he didn't have Matthew's creative fire, nor his radicalism. So there's no way he wrote them. And yet, in his diary is one of the poems that appears in the carpet bag under Trismegistus. And then there's another poem in there that has his name on it in his papers, which apparently somebody else had copied over. So we don't have his handwriting on that one. We don't know where he claims to have derived it. But the first poem that's in his diary, he definitely says that he wrote it, and it is in an entry from October 1849, which is 2 years before the carpet bag was launched. So this is damning evidence, if you take it at face value. And yet he can't possibly have been the author. This is the weird thing. So how did this happen? So the first thing we're going to do is go back and establish that Matthew used this pseudonym, Trismegistus, much earlier than the carpet bag and much earlier than 1849. We don't have that particular poem, but we have the pseudonym. So I think before I even do that, I'll talk a little bit about what this means again, wrap up a little bit, because not everybody watching this will have watched yesterday's entry. Matthew's future wife, Abby Poyen, who was 4 years younger, came from an upper-class French family. She no doubt had been tutored, and as near as I can tell, she took on the role of Matthew's tutor, substituting for the college education he was not able to obtain. And one of the things she tried to teach him, one of the subjects, which he rather resisted at first, was mysticism. So she had no doubt read the teachings of Hermes, probably alchemy. I know she read Eastern philosophy. There's references to that. Maybe the Kabbalah, who knows what sources. She was apparently raised Catholic, but her mother was a mystic and taught Abby. She also knew astrology and palm reading and, all of these subjects. So she was a New Age girl before there was a New Age. And she tried to teach these things to Matthew, and he just wouldn't have it. He actually made fun of them. But he apparently adopted this pseudonym, Trismegistus, in jest initially, because it means thrice great. Hermes Trismegistus means thrice great. And Matthew apparently thought that was funny, so he wrote a couple things under that pseudonym. So we're going to look at those very briefly. Here's one short example. I'll put it up on the screen. I'm going to start editing in some of these things as opposed to holding them up to the camera. And the main reason I want to do that is with these large volumes, I think it's a little dangerous to the volume. Probably people who know antiques cringe when I hold up one of these large volumes to the camera and the spine goes, it kind of makes me cringe too when I watch it. So I won't be doing that, I don't think. But this is from the July 17, 1829 edition of the New England Galaxy. I know that Matthew was writing for this paper, and I'll share again with you how I know, one reason I know. But this is a short piece. The march of mind in this present age is at once attested and promoted by the practice of combining oral instruction with the display of figures, machines, models, and apparatus of various sorts. This practice, though of no recent origin, is nowadays carried to a remarkable extent. It is found susceptible of application to a vast variety of objects. I make these remarks because there has recently been a very successful instance in a town not more than 1,000 miles distant of lecturing upon superstitions with an apparatus. I have not yet been able to ascertain all the facts of this singular circumstance, which I regret, as I am sure that they would be interesting and instructive to your readers. Perhaps, however, my inquiries may be crowned with success, in which case I may be able to enrich your columns with a capital ghost story, capital G, capital S, signed Trismegistus. Now, again, at this early stage in 1829, Matthew was a skeptic, a philosophical skeptic, and he poked fun at all things woo-woo, see? Whereas Abby was a psychic and was trying to bring him around, and she did eventually. By the time they wrote the original of A Christmas Carol together, they both believed in these things, see? Even though Matthew kind of took the devil's advocate position as Scrooge, he believed in it along with Abby. But at this point, he was making fun of these things. So apparently, he had read of someone who was trying to prove the existence of spirits with some kind of machine, and he thought it was hilarious. So he wrote this totally tongue-in-cheek piece about it. So now we're going to move forward to the New York Transcript. Matthew was also writing for this paper, so I can definitely show that Matthew was writing for both of these newspapers. And these are two poems, and they're back to back. The first one is signed Trismegistus, but there was apparently a protocol in these papers where if they published two poems by the same person, they wouldn't necessarily sign both of them. They just gang them together. So I think that's what they did here, that both of these poems were actually by Matthew. The first one, which I won't read all of these, but it's called A Small Specimen of the Fashionably Simple Style for the Lovers of Nature. And it's a sarcastic poem, apparently answering Abby's vegetarianism. See, because I think she was a vegetarian and she thought that animals, were living beings with souls, and which I do too. In that day, it was not fashionable to think of that. Christianity believed that animals did not have souls, and that gave them a carte blanche excuse to slaughter them, see, if they didn't have souls. Well, Abby knew that they did. So Matthew wrote this satirical poem in response. He says, "Yea, geese are good. A charm is theirs, which ducks, though fat and plump, have not, though nourished by the summer airs and fatted in a swampy spot. And turkey too, oh, who would say that turkey is not very good? For search the land and search the sea, you cannot meet with better food." So in other words, he was saying that, yeah, animals are really good and delicious, in fact. Then right below it is another poem. Now, apparently, this infuriated Abby, but I know because I have emotional past life memory at this life. And what I know from that is she was scared by this because she wanted to marry Matthew. She'd already decided she wanted to marry him, even though she was quite a bit younger. And all of that depended on Matthew being a spiritual person, which is to say that he had a soul. She wouldn't marry somebody who was a worldly clod, who was insensitive to spiritual realities. Matthew, in her view, was kind of a diamond in the rough who had the potential to be, a sage. But she was kind of working on him. See, she was fixing him, which you can do with soulmates. Don't try it with anybody else. That's what I've learned. But with real soulmates, which these two were, you can actually redeem your partner. So she was bringing him around, but this scared her because it really seemed very worldly and insensitive. And she thought, oh, what have I gotten myself into, emotionally? So apparently they had a big fight. And maybe she called it off or something. I don't think they didn't really have a relationship. What is this, 35? Yeah, they did. They were courting at this time. So they must have had a big fight. And she said, oh, I can't marry somebody like that, So he writes, from a sentimental swain to a fickle mistress. This comes right under the other poem. Oh, do not turn thy face away, sweet lady, dear from me. Soon, soon, alas, must end my day if I thy phiz don't see. So Matthew writes seriously, but he can't resist putting in a little bit of colloquialism or a little bit of humor with the word fizz, which was one of his favorites for face. This is also seen in The Raven. If you read the introduction to The Raven, where it was originally published, you'll see that the editor talks about this wry sense of humor in the middle of this terrible grief poem, Well, that was Matthew. That was typical for him. And then he goes on. It's actually I'll read it all. It's half comical and half serious because that was his personality. He would always hide his deepest feelings in humor, and yet this is really a love poem. Oh, do not turn thy face away, sweet lady, dear from me. Soon, soon, alas, must end my day if I thy phiz don't see. In thy soft beams I live alive, from them I draw my light. And whilst they brightly on me shone, as seemed that all was bright. But now a dismal cloud appears to darken o'er my sky. My bosom heaves with restless fears. Oh my, oh my, oh my. So it's a humorous poem, but it isn't, because that's exactly what he's feeling, you see. Again, this was Matthew, but this first one, and presumably both of them, are signed Trismegistus. So here he appears again, a second time, in a publication which I know he was publishing. So now we turn once again, as I did last time, to Joseph T. Buckingham's. This is a like 1920 something, I don't know when it was, 50s reprint. This is a reprint of his original 1852 memoirs, 1970, I'm sorry. I haven't had much sleep yet again. So he says about the New England Galaxy, in which Matthew began publishing at age 12 in 1825. He says, while the Galaxy was thus conducted, the labors of the editors were lightened by the contributions of Moses Whitney, which is a disguised version of Matthew Whittier. And notice that he's going by M and not by Franklin or Frank, as the Whittier historians believe. Lightened by the contributions of Moses Whitney, Jr., a young gentleman engaged in mercantile pursuits, which Matthew was. His pieces are signed, quote, Trismegistus. He had written many brief paragraphs for the paper in years preceding, which means as early as 1825, under various signatures, generally on light and transient topics, which had no other importance or claim to notice than that they afforded opportunities for the exhibition of the wit and humor for which their author was celebrated. So Matthew was a humorist. See, so and he is celebrated as Ethan Spike. So all that's correct. It's not correct that they were all on light and transient topics, because some of it was quite sophisticated early on. But notice that he says under various signatures. Now, I kind of bypassed that last time. I glossed over it. That's extremely significant because you've got triangulation here of several unique elements. First off, you've got this signature, which has a backstory. Secondly, you've got that he was engaged in mercantile pursuits, which that narrows it down quite a bit, because not all authors were engaged in mercantile pursuits, and Matthew definitely was. And then you've got that he wrote under various signatures. Now, he just kind of passes that by as a curiosity, but not that many writers did that. Some did. There were people that wrote under signatures that kind of related to the article at hand, but not so many people adopted a whole bunch of different signatures like Matthew did. He did that all his life, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of them. I haven't counted them all. So that's kind of an odd trait. If you look up lists of authors and their pseudonyms, and you can find these lists online where somebody has compiled all these things, you won't find very many that have more than about two. Edgar Allan Poe didn't use them. John Townsend Trowbridge had, I believe it was Paul Creighton he used, and that was all he used. Of course, Samuel Clemens used Mark Twain. Very few people had a whole bunch of them like Matthew did. So when you put all those clues together, Moses Whitney is Matthew Franklin Whittier. So the editor of the paper is saying that he was Trismegistus, back then. There was one in the New England Galaxy signed Trismegistus that I did not find a physical copy or a photographic copy of, but it's a good example of the sophistication of Matthew's work. It's called Ideas on Poetry. It's very satirical, and I think it might even be a satire on Edgar Allan Poe's first book of poetry. Could be wrong about that, but anyway, I'll read a little bit of it. He says, "Mr. Editor, I am an insatiable reader of true poetry," which Matthew was. He was the younger brother of John Greenleaf Whittier, remember? "That is to say, I read whatever is published at the present day, and think myself all the while very profitably occupied. It constitutes as large a proportion of our literary atmosphere as oxygen does of common air. No man can live in modern times without breathing in modern poetry, and no man can breathe it in without feeling its effects." He goes on like that, but you get the idea of his prose. This was, Matthew was what? He was 15 when he wrote this. So he goes on, and then he gives an example of some local, which is to say Boston poets, production, okay? And let's see, he says, "I know a young man of great expectations who has just commenced his poetical career with a dream in blank verse 3 columns long, so true to nature that you might believe he had caught his fancies in the very act, so insinuating that I could never, for the life of me, read so much as the first 10 lines without snoring." Matthew's very sarcastic. "The public will be glad to learn that his friends have induced him to prepare an octavo volume for the press, of which the following pieces, copied from his table of contents, will constitute a chief part." Now he gets into the list here. "Ode for Muster Day." Now, you know, Matthew was very satirical and sarcastic about the military musters. "Written by request and sung with great applause." Remember, Matthew was a Quaker who was anti-war. "Anacreontic Serenade." I don't know what anacreontic means. "Stanzas in heroic measure on a mammoth calf, capital M, seen at a cattle show. Allegory in 6 cantos, immortality of the soul. Tragedy in 2 acts, bloody murder of 6 militiamen. 40 pages of monologues, epigrams, and acrostics. The rear is brought up by an elegy on the death of my great-grandmother at the age of 103 in the measure of Hudibras." Okay, some of these references I don't know, but terribly sarcastic stuff. This is Matthew at age 15, as signing as Trismegistus. Okay, so I don't know why Joseph T. Buckingham thought they were all light and frivolous. They were sarcastic, but they weren't light. See, that's the difference. So now we're going to get into the carpet bag. And again, here's the carpet bag, volume 1. I'm going to leave the plastic on, and I'm not going to hold it up and have the spine go. We are now getting into the same edition, which had the picture of Mrs. Partington, which I showed you yesterday. It's on the same page. This is the June 28, 1851 edition. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Here is a poem called Cheerfulness in Old Age, the Young Man's Question. I'm going to go ahead and read all of this. The Young Man's Question. Old man, how canst thou cheerful be? A smile how canst thou wear? The type is very small here, excuse me. Dead are the children dear to thee, dead she who did them bear. Thou wert beloved of thy race, to them thy heart was true, yet melancholy o'er thy face sheds not its somber hue. Is it a hardness from below, or comfort from on high, which thus absolves thee from thy woe, and bids thy tears be dry? And then the old man's answer. Tall are the trees with leaves bedight, in summer's garb arrayed. Their small horizon bounds my sight, and wraps my cot in shade. But when in winter's withering air their leaves with dust shall blend, I see the stars through branches bare, from heaven their glories send. Thus, when our earthly joys decay and perish in the tomb, from heaven an unobstructed ray illumes our pathway home. Signed, Trismegistus. Now, there's a couple things in this poem that are embedded in here. First of all, this is atypical. It's supposed to be archetypal. The young man asks the old man. But the old man's situation is that he has outlived not only his wife, but his children. Okay, so we're on notice that this is autobiographical for somebody and not general. Okay. Now we have the analogy of the stars coming out when in old age, when the leaves fall, and you can see this in the fall, and you can see the stars, then you see, heaven. Well, Abby loved the stars. She wrote about the stars beautifully. And any time that Matthew refers to Abby, almost always the stars are going to be in there somewhere. He slips them in. That means it's a tribute to her, see? So what he's saying is he feels old, and Matthew he loved the phrase the olden. He used that pseudonym, but Francis Durivage stole it. When Francis Durivage stole it, he thought it meant the devil. So Francis Durivage was signing as the olden, meaning he was the devil because he was a sociopath. But when Matthew used the olden, he meant that he felt old, after Abby died. Also, he felt that he was an old soul, which she probably told him. There's all these personal references embedded in these that mark them as Matthew's, along with Trismegistus as a signature, which he had used before, see, based on the things that Abby had taught him. So it's all deeply personal. Now suddenly we find, and I don't have this in front of me because it's digital, we suddenly find in Benjamin Drew's diary that he had that poem in his diary. Now let me see which one that is. He called it The Question. It's in October of 1849 in his diary, and he says that he wrote it in his diary. And this is the guy that Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber said in his memoirs. This is the guy he said was Trismegistus. And here's this poem signed Trismegistus in the carpetbag 2 years earlier in Benjamin Drew's diary. But it can't be him. It can't be. This guy was not deep. He was not a mystic. And this is deeply mystical and deeply personal, this poem. So the only answer that I can think of is that once again, and there's many instances of this, Matthew had privately shared this poem with Benjamin Drew by way of mentoring him. Benjamin Drew wasn't really much of a poet, see? So he'd shared it. And Drew, unlike some of these people, like there's a fellow named Robert Johnson who wrote poetry for the Boston Weekly Museum, who actually published Matthew's poetry under his own name. Well, Drew wasn't quite that brazen, but what he did is he wrote it in his diary, and then people would share their diaries with their family, with their spouses. And so apparently he said, well, I just want my wife to admire me, you know. So that's the only thing I could think of, is that he wrote it in his diary. In his diary said that he had just written it and then showed it to his wife, you know. So then there's another one in Drew's diary which shows up in the carpet bag. Now, if I move to, let's see, I've got it written down over here. January 3rd, 1852, and that still is in this volume, which I'm not going to pick up and try to show to you. It's called Light in Darkness. And underneath it says written for the carpet bag, and it says selected from the juvenile poems of E.G. Digg. So it's a spin-off from the Trismegistus series, from the Trismegistus name. And this is supposed to be the poems that Dr. Digg wrote when he was a young man. Some of them, I think, are literally Matthew's early work. And it reads, so I wanted to make clear that this is a Trismegistus piece. It's just a spin-off. Okay, so he says, from dusky, blackest anthracite, what fires all brightly glow, from muddy beds of western streams, what golden treasures grow. From sooty work about the forge, from rusty anvils ring, the blacksmith hoards the money clean as that of any king. So from the inkstand's ebon pool, from the mixtures black and base, genius can paint the glowing thought to bless the human race. Now, so what he's saying is that from the struggles of a genius's life can come beautiful writing. See? Now, you have to understand that Matthew knew that he was a literary genius. He knew it from childhood, and he alludes to it from behind the scenes around the corner a number of times. And he struggled greatly in his life, and especially after Abby died, he was struggling. But he knew that from those struggles could come some beautiful writing, beautiful poetry, and beautiful prose. And he uses here the analogy of, printer's ink, and also of coal, and I'm not sure what, I guess he's saying things forged in the workshop, from coal in the blacksmith's shop. And those are his analogies. These are deeply personal, deeply mystical poems. There's nothing of that in Benjamin Drew. Like I said, he was a kind of a bland fellow who had a pretty good life as a career teacher and a principal. He had everything Matthew didn't, and Matthew had everything he didn't, if that makes sense. But he wanted what Matthew had, so he appropriated it. So let's go back to another Trismegistus piece. In that earlier edition, the one that has cheerfulness in old age, it's in that same edition. And rather than hold it up again, I'm going to show you a graphic. This is called The Yellow Squall Hound. And the subtitle is The New Mackerel Boat Recently Launched at Hull, written for the carpetbag. And here's what it looks like. It has an image of the thing. And it's very detailed. This is signed Trismegistus. It goes into great technical detail about this wonderful new boat. And you'd swear it was real. I actually had to send a copy of this to a maritime museum and ask them, is this real or is this a parody? And they wrote back and said, no, this is a parody. This isn't real. This is tongue in cheek, So Matthew apparently is satirizing people that brag on their brand new boats, and technology in their boats. But he's like ramping it up to the nth degree as a satire. But it also shows how knowledgeable he was. And either that or he got somebody, an expert to back him up, as a consultant. Because, it goes into tremendous detail. Well, I know that Matthew was fascinated by technology, and I know that he was fascinated by all things nautical. he apparently actually ran away from home and went to sea for a while as a boy, but his stomach wasn't up to it. He had terrible seasickness, and he had terrible problems with his stomach. And apparently they dropped him off in Cuba for a while, where he worked in a shop or something and had a miserable time, and then caught the next boat back to the United States, and that was the end of his seafaring, until in 1851, writing as Quails for the Boston Weekly Museum, he went to Europe. And on the way back, they had a rough patch, and he had such horrible seasickness that the doctor stayed with him, and he almost lost his life. It's not specifically said, but probably he was vomiting blood because of his probably he had an ulcer. I think he had an ulcer for most of his life, and almost lost his life in that. So I don't think he ever really went to sea again, except maybe up and down the coast to get places. But he was fascinated by the sea, and I think that's because he had a nautical lifetime just before this one. But I'm going to read a little bit of the Yellow Squall Hound just to give you an idea. This was also signed Trismegistus. Mr. Editor, among the many notices of the new ships on improved sailing principles, which have recently been added to our marine, I have hitherto seen no mention of the clipper boat Yellow Squall Hound. She was built in Hull. Her keel was laid by her accomplished owner, Squire Pollock, on the 18th of March last. It is of the best hornbeam, and is beveled off at the stern 1 1/4 inches. The level of the keel is 21 feet, 7 1/9 inches, breadth 8 1/5 inches, depth 6 2/15 inches. To this is secured a keelson, 2 sister keelsons, and 1 brother and 1 nephew keelson. The fastenings mostly relied on here are the best double 10-penny nails from the celebrated works of the, quote, Sprue Iron Company. The forefoot is secured by ankle ties of hoop iron, let into the knees, where they are held by wrought sixpennies. The stern post is black birch, worked 4 inches square, and to this are attached the rudder hinges. The stern post is mortised into the keel at the distance of 1 foot from the great bevel, which, with the dead rise at half floor, added to the breadth of the keelson straps, allows the caboose to stand 1 foot further aft than is customary in boats of her class. And it goes on and on and on and on like that. See, so it's all tongue-in-cheek. There's no indication that Benjamin Drew had the ability to write anything like that, or the interest to write anything like that. See, so I think I would say it's a done deal. But here's the truth: I have evidence much stronger than that Matthew was the real author of the Raven, and I have evidence much stronger than that Matthew and Abby were the real authors of A Christmas Carol, and 2 or 3, a couple other famous ones. See, so when I announce these things, I'm sure that people get this vision of this crazy person who should be in a straitjacket, just like all the other New Age crazies who are, telling you that they're communicating with aliens in the Pleiades or somewhere, or the Belt of Orion or something, and some of them could be true for all I know, but they have no evidence, absolutely zero real evidence for those things that they claim. And then I come along and claim this crazy thing that in my past life I wrote the Raven. Well, who the heck is he? There's no point in paying any more attention to him. He's a nutcase. I've actually got the evidence. I'm telling you, I have the evidence. I can prove it. It's deep. Matthew was very well hidden. Even in the carpet bag, he's very deeply hidden. He's all through this thing. But, you have to know what you're looking for. And I did. I spent 10, 11 years deeply researching these things. So here's my plug again. In Real Paranormal Magazine, in the next edition, which comes out the end of this month, supposedly, I have a long, detailed, logical, persuasive article which explains how I know that Matthew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier were the real authors of A Christmas Carol, and how I know that Charles Dickens could not possibly have written that book. I'm not blowing smoke any more than I am with Trismegistus. So I hope that someone will take it seriously and actually read it and actually read the whole thing and let the cumulative evidence impact you, you know. let it in, you know, it's truth. And let it transform you. I think that's why I'm not very popular, because what I'm doing is transformative and there's no lower hooks in it. You know, I'm not hooking your lower nature anywhere. I'm just giving you something that's transformative and elevating. And that has never been popular, you know, in the history of mankind. But it's desperately needed right now. For one thing, Charles Dickens is going down the tubes very quickly. As we speak, Charles Dickens is going down the tubes because he's being found out as an ass. You know, I won't go into the details of that, but his reputation is going down into the mud. I would like to see A Christmas Carol snatched from his grasp before he goes into the mud. I don't want to see The Christmas Carol going down into the mud with him. And the reason for that is if people get the idea that good fruit can come from bad trees, they will feel that there is no real intrinsic morality, that any scoundrel can produce a work of spiritual inspiration and it's all just imagination. None of it is real, see, which is not true. A work of real spiritual inspiration has to come from real spiritual people. So it's desperately important, in my opinion, that Matthew and Abby Whittier are correctly credited with A Christmas Carol before Dickens goes down. And he is going down. Not from me, but from other scholars. And the same eventually will happen with the others that stole from Matthew. I mean, Poe is already in the mud, basically. And people imagine that that's a horror poem, The Raven. And they imagine that this guy who basically had no scruples, the more you look into his life, you realize it's all a big show. Anything that looks like scruples is a big show, and the guy had none. That he could create a masterpiece like The Raven. So it's not only important, in my view, to attribute this to the correct author, to Matthew Franklin Whittier. It's desperately important to get it away from Edgar Allan Poe. And so on with the others. So that's all I wanted to share with you today. I won't make this any longer. And I hope somebody's still with me watching this. If not, hopefully in the future at some point. But this carpetbag is a fascinating business. But again, there's so many clever period references that it would really take a historian to sit down with you and present some of these things. So once again, thank you for watching.